All right. Morning, everybody. You may be seated in here. It's great to see everybody here. You guys at home aren't able to be with us. Certainly miss you guys. Thinking about you. Certainly too, as it seems like we're settling into this pattern, as we keep saying, for a little bit of while. Keep in touch with us and let us know if there's things that come up, needs that you might have, or needs that you know of in your neighborhood or your community. Especially as we get into these times where we're sort of going back to school, but not going back to school. Everybody's going to be staying at home, and maybe, dual income families are probably wondering how in the world they're going to manage all of that. If you catch wind of just needs and opportunities that your neighbors present, please let us know. We'd love to think about creative ways of reaching out and showing the love of Christ these days. So, as we kind of round out the summer a little bit, we're also rounding out our summer sermon series that we've been doing on classic spiritual disciplines, or these practices that as we give of ourselves to these things, we create space in our lives for God to meet with us and to grow us in our love for Christ and our appreciation of the life that He calls us to. Past couple weeks, we've been looking at more corporate disciplines, things that we do together as a means of growing up together in Christ and together as His people. So we looked at worship last week, and 2 weeks ago we looked at the Lord's Supper. And today, just in these last few ones that we have together, we're going to look at one that I'm excited to talk with you about, partly because it's such a rich theme throughout the Scriptures. Partly because in my own life, I think this is one of the disciplines where God most significantly met me and challenged and grew me and perhaps our family. And it was also through this that it was kind of like the entryway for me to get more interested in, okay, so what are the other classical spiritual disciplines that help us grow? And I'm also thankful for the opportunity to have spent the week kind of being refreshed and reminded about this, partly because I feel like in my own life I've let my practice of this kind of go lax, or a little bit more unintentional, if you will, and so it was good for me to spend time in that, which is all to say I'm excited to talk through that a little bit with you this morning. Today we're going to be looking at the practice of faithful Sabbath keeping. All right? Sabbath keeping is a massive topic, cover to cover in the Scriptures, and so we're not nearly going to be able to look at the whole thing this morning. My intention is to give you just broadly what Sabbath is about, kind of zero in on one particular aspect of why God's people were called to keep Sabbath and what it was about. And then maybe try to just give a few practical suggestions like we often do here as we're talking our way through this. All right, so that's where we're going. But before we dive into officially talking about Sabbath, I feel like there's one bigger topic related to it that we have to kind of just talk about a little bit. It's going to be something that we have to think about in relation to Sabbath, and it's maybe something that's been brewing as we've been talking about these practices or habits, maybe, that we are being invited to incorporate into our life. And so where we want to start is actually where Mike it's sort of towards the close of Mike's sermon last week as he was working us through Psalm 96. He did a great job working us through that really rich psalm. And you maybe remember that towards the end of the psalm, you see all of creation starting to join in on this, great song of praise to the Creator. And Mike pointed out that, hey, this is what it means to be a creature, or someone or something created, is that we are by design created to be worshipers. And this is where Mike told us the story as he's remodeling his kitchen, and he's putting up his cabinets, and he learned for the first time what a hammer drill was. And as he saw how this hammer drill made such easy work of installing these cabinets, he talked about how, it's a really beautiful thing when you see this neat piece of machinery operating according to design. And he was sort of connecting that to that in our own lives kind of hum, or they are, working most beautifully when we are working according to design, right? And by design, we are created to be worshipers. I think Mike said that we're always worshiping because that's who we are. We're never not worshiping. We might not be worshiping the living God as we ought to be, but it's probably that we're worshiping something else. It's never that we stop worshiping, because by design, we are primarily worshiping creatures. Or maybe another way to think about this, or another way to simply say it, is that we are fundamentally lovers. Right? That by design, we are fundamentally the people who are created to love the Lord our God with all of our heart, mind, and strength, and to love our neighbor, right, as ourselves. Or to love our neighbor with as much energy and excitement and sacrificial resolve as we would love ourselves. And, okay, so I point this all out just because sometimes, maybe when we think about ourselves, we might tend to think about ourselves as primarily thinking creatures. That we're just primarily rational, logic, thinking creatures. And that certainly is a major part of who we are. But fundamentally, I think more actually that we are worshipers and lovers. Or you can say it this way, that fundamentally the Christian life is not just thinking the right things, or even just believing the right things. That's certainly a huge part of the Christian life. But fundamentally, the Christian life, as Jesus described it, is loving God with our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving our neighbor as ourselves. So here's the question for you. How is it that our loves are shaped in us? Or how is it that our worship is molded and fashioned and shaped within us? All right, that's my question to start us off. And maybe I'll ask the question in another way, or a little bit more specifically. I'll give an example. I assume you know, I'm a lover of the Phillies. All right? I enjoy watching the Phillies. I enjoy subjecting my kids when we go on car rides to listening to Scott Fransky and what's his name? Larry Anderson, thank you. Giving the play-by-play as we're driving up to the grandparents' house or whatever. I love going to games, and I'm sort of sad that we can't go to a game this summer or whatever. So here's the question. Where did that love of Phillies come from? How was that love of the Phillies molded and shaped in my heart and my life? I can tell you one way. I'm pretty sure it didn't happen. I'm pretty sure there was never a point in the time when my dad sat me down and went through a sustained treatment of logical, rational arguments for why I ought to be a Phillies fan. I'm not sure there is such a thing. I don't think he ever sat me down and grabbed out the baseball stat book and said, let me show you statistically the greatest baseball teams all throughout history, proving to you why you should be a Phillies fan. Or let me show you all the scientific research that shows that the Phillies fans are the happiest, most fulfilled, most satisfied people in all of life. I'm not sure there's any of those statistics out there. In other words, I don't think we had a talk about it, and all of a sudden in my head I got and all of a sudden it roused in my heart this love of the Phillies. Probably more happened because, when I was a young kid, sort of raised in North Philadelphia area, I just happened to notice that everybody around me was all into the Phillies, so they must be this important thing or whatever. Or then later in life, we kind of moved out to more central western Pennsylvania. Couldn't really watch Phillies games out there. But every time we would come back to the Philly area, and I would come back to my grandparents' house, which I love to do in the summer or throughout the year, my grandfather, whenever he could, he would always have the Phillies game on in the background if it was on that night. Or he'd have his little box radio sitting on the kitchen table, with the voice of Harry Callis and Richie Allen or Wheels, at that point, kind of working, just playing the game. And as I had this love from my grandparents and coming back to the Phillies, it was all kind of connected with hearing the sounds of Harry Callis and Phillies baseball. Or it was maybe through the summers, my mom and my dad maybe taking me down to Old Veterans Stadium and taking me to the game and watching the Philly Fanatic and looking at all the players out there and coming early. Or maybe it was through then, in my love of baseball cards, wanting to collect all the Phillies, every year that would come out in the packs, or try to boost my Mike Schmidt collection. The point being is that my love for this, my love for the Phillies, more developed out as a result of certain activities and practices and summer rituals. And so can I say it this way? I think sometimes when we think about how it is our loves are shaped, or our worship and our lives are formed in the pattern of Christ, sometimes we only think about that as happening through words and ideas and truths and doctrines or whatever, aimed at our mind, which then we assume transforms everything else. I mean, just think about the way we do church life and church ministry, right? Probably not all of our ministry certainly, but a majority of our ministry probably, when we think about how we form and grow disciples, probably happens in a situation like this, where you're all in a room and seated, and somebody is dispensing ideas and truths and words to your minds to shape the way you think and understand. Or in your homes. If I would ask you as parents, how do you conceive of going about training and discipling and growing your children? Probably the first thing you might naturally go to is, well, I teach them and I talk to them and I tell them about who Christ is and all that he's done, and I train their minds to think appropriately. And hear me, please, hear me. That is all extremely important, and that is a huge aspect of disciple making, right? We looked at that a couple weeks ago in Romans 12, so I'm not in any way downplaying that. What I'm saying here is that, well, I'll put it this way, there's growing interest in the field of social sciences in a variety of places on how it is that people grow and are shaped and are formed, not just through ideas and words and truths, but actually through practices and habits and rituals. Psychologists these days are moving away from such a fundamentally cognitive-based therapy models into more experiential therapy models because they're seeing great value in that. Or even educators these days are exploring experiential modes of learning. There's some great Christian education theorists out in the Midwest, James K.A. Smith, who I love to read, who's exploring about the benefits of rituals and patterns and liturgies in the formation of an individual. And here's the thing. Scripture, or all of church history, and I would argue the great consensus of Scripture too, is that yes, patterns and habits and liturgical practices, worship practices, and rituals are a huge part of the formation of an individual, of a worshiper, of a lover of God. We don't get warm, fuzzy feelings as good modern 21st century Americans when we think about that term ritual. There's a whole lot of reasons for that, which I won't go into culturally and historically, but generally we tend to prefer more spontaneous, organic ways of doing life. We tend to think that's more exciting or more authentic, whereas ritual is inauthentic and boring. But here's kind of the point that I have to make this morning that you see throughout Scripture. There is this emphasis on practices and habits and rituals as places where God meets with his people and grows them and shapes them. You don't have to go any further than the opening pages of your Old Testament to see that, right? When you see the Israelites who are being gathered together as God's people, shaped and molded and commissioned, man, in the instructions that are given to them are all sorts of instructions filled with ritual practices, festivals, feasts, and ceremonies that are to mark their years and to mark their months and to mark even their weeks and their days, right? And here's the point. Here's a really important point. Those festivals, those rituals, and those practices, they weren't because God needed them. Right? God isn't giving them to the people because, hey, I have a low self-esteem, and so I need you every month to come together and have this great festival in my honor. No, he's giving to them festivals and feasts and weekly remembrance ceremonies because they need it. Because they're fickle lovers who are prone to give their loves to any other god that comes their way. Or they're quick to forget all the incredible things that God had done for them, or the ways that God had been so gracious to them. Or they're quick to forget their identity as God's chosen and holy people. Right? So the rituals and the practices, these were things intended to help Israel be more rooted in who they were, to help Israel be more rooted in remembrance of all that God had done, help root Israel and to shape and mold and grow their life, their love, and their worship. You all still with me? I feel like what I just wanted to do this morning, we have such a negative perception of rituals, and I just had to point out the obvious, that throughout Scripture, rituals and practices and habits are all part of God's designed discipleship process. I feel like we had to cover that first before we talk about maybe one of the chief rituals, that of Sabbath keeping. This weekly stoppage of work and activities, this weekly setting apart a day as distinct and holy for who God is and what He intends to do in the lives of His people. Again, we can't dive into the whole thing about Sabbath. A great resource if you want to do that and you want to go a little bit deeper into what Sabbath and all these festivals were about, I would point you actually towards the Bible Project, BibleProject.com. Type in Sabbath rest in their search thing and you'll get one of their little, 6-7 minute videos, which is great. But then usually on that page, you go down a little bit further and you have additional resources. And there you can see they did like a 7-part, go figure, series on a podcasting where they really dive into the nitty-gritty of how Sabbath works its way throughout. And it's really interesting stuff. Go check it out sometime if you want. But we're just going to look at a few things about how Sabbath function and operate in the Scriptures and the lives of God's people. And to start it off, I would say this. I think what's most important for getting your mind around the concept of what is Sabbath is actually first starting to think about what it is not. And what I find most helpful to remember is that Sabbath keeping is not taking a day off. Okay, it's not the equivalent of the modern American day off, right? When we think of a day off, we think of a day just to stop, to rest, to recharge, to de-stress from all the pressures and the stresses and the obligations of the work week in the past, get your energy back up to go back to work on Monday morning or whatever. Maybe it's some me time, some time to catch up on the chores or the list of the things that I have to do at the house that I haven't been able to because stuff has been so crazy at work, whatever. Okay, that is not fundamentally what Sabbath is. Sabbath, first and foremost, it's a day not so much about your personal recharging or getting caught up on your to-do list. Sabbath, first and foremost, is a day from sunup to sundown or whatever that you are setting apart as distinct, as holy, and that you are setting apart, you are creating space in your week so that you can be attentive, mindful of who God is, mindful of everything that He has done, and also just be attentive to what it is He is doing in your life, in the lives of His people, in the lives of His within His creation. In other words, it's taking what we're doing here when we come for worship and making a day out of it, essentially. Not that you have to sit here for the whole day, but that's the idea of the whole day. The whole day is a day where I'm stopping and I'm setting it aside to be attentive to who God is and what He's up to. Okay? Not the traditional American day off. Probably most simply or most basically, when we think Sabbath, we're thinking resting. The original command in the book of Exodus is that on the seventh day you are to rest from your labors. And here's the idea. We are resting as a way of being mindful that God is the creator. Okay? I mean, think about it. You know, for an Israelite who works the field for their substance, for their whole livelihood, right? To take one day where, okay, I'm going to take my hand off the plow, take my hand off the wheel, I'm going to take my hand off of everything. It is a reminder to them that, okay, first and foremost, this world it belongs to God. He's the creator of it. It's mine to not just endlessly, it's not mine to endlessly exploit however I want to do that. And look, as I take my hand off the wheel or I take my hand off the plow or I'm not in the nitty-gritty controlling how this all goes down, look, it still goes. That God is the sustainer. It's His world. He claims ownership of it. He created it, and He's going to sustain it, even if I don't have my hands on the wheel every single day of the week. Okay? So it's a day to stop as a way of remembering, oh yes, God is the creator. This world belongs to the creator. Another way to think of that, too, is to say it's a day to stop and to remember that God is holy. Right? What do we say when we say that God is the creator? Well, we're also saying that God is not the creation, or he's not a part of the creation. He's the one who created the creation, so he's not technically a part of the creation. He's technically not in the creation. He's outside of it. He's radically distinct from it. He's radically separate. He's radically other from everything else that you see around you, and that's the common definition of what it means to be holy. Right? So Sabbath was this day that the whole day was like a symbol or a signal that pointed the Israelites to the transcendence and to the holiness of God, their creator. You might come across a lot of people, or some people who will talk about Sabbath as a sanctuary in time. And what they would mean by that is, like if you think about the Israelites in the wilderness, they had this in the center of their camp. They had the tabernacle. And if you remember, if you go in the tabernacle and you look at the tapestry or the furniture or all the things related to it, there were all these signals that, reminded the Israelites of God's holiness. And so wherever they went, they had this thing moving with them to remind them that God was holy. Or they had all these ceremonies that they would do to remind them that God is holy. Well, now in the rhythm of time, you have this sanctuary of God's holiness, or you have this day that from beginning to end is a signal, a pointer to God's holiness. Okay? So a day to rest, to remember God is the creator, remember he's holy. It's a day to get out and enjoy God's creation too, delight in God's creation as a way of pointing your attention to the Creator and delighting in the Creator, giving honor and thankfulness back to the Creator. When we get into the book of Deuteronomy, and we get the second coming, if you will, of the command to honor Sabbath, there, actually, the emphasis is not so much on the individual stopping and resting, but the emphasis more is on those who are around you, making sure they are able to rest. Whether it's your children, or it's your servants, or the sojourners, the non-Israelites who are in your midst, or whether it's even your ox and your animals, making sure they have opportunity to rest. So this is more about others resting. And there the reference is not going back to creation, but in Deuteronomy the reference actually is for remember that the Lord your God is the one who delivered you out of tireless labor at the hand of the tyrant Pharaoh, and gave you rest. And so Sabbath keeping is also a way to remember God's gracious redemptive activity on your behalf and to participate with him in showing that kind of concern to others. Kind of brings out more of the relational, social, maybe even justice issues related to the Sabbath. And here's what I point out as well too, because I think this is important. In the Old Testament especially, Sabbath was something that the people did all together. Right? You didn't individually decide, okay, which day I'm going to take and I'm going to take a rest from. No, Sabbath was something that all the people did together on the seventh day. And if you think about that, if you think about Sabbath as the Sabbath day as being this powerful symbol, reminder of the holiness of God as creator, of God as redeemer, well, what makes it even more powerful is when all the people are kind of doing it together. Right? When everybody is keeping Sabbath together, man, then individually you're getting, wherever you look, you are getting a powerful signal of God's holiness, a powerful signal of all that God has done. Which is all to say, just imagine if Christians everywhere today more regularly practiced Sabbath. There could be a really powerful effect, both in the individual's lives, but then also think of the way it would signal God's value or whatever to the culture around you, which is also what the Sabbath was intended to do. It'd probably be similar to every time you drive past a Chick-fil-A on Sunday. If you're like me, your first thought is, dang it, I can't get one of those chicken sandwiches and the waffle fries and the lemonade today. But maybe if you get past the disappointment of not being able to get your number one value meal, you might have the thought, isn't that strange that there is something to at least the higher-ups in Chick-fil-A of greater value than just perpetually making more money? Or there's something out there that more defines the life of these Chick-fil-A owners than just increasing in material wealth and prosperity, or they're not just defined by what they do and their work, such that they would actually want to take a day and honor to God. Can you imagine if we all did that together, if Christians everywhere just took a day and just stopped, stopped arguing, stopped complaining about stuff on Facebook or whatever, and just started, for one day, we're going to give thanks and be joyful, and I think that could be. The other reason I say that, this is not in any way to shift blame or anything like that, but I think part of my own reason why Sabbath keeping has fallen off of intentionality. I should say I'm doing well at taking a day off. I don't think I'm doing well at intentionally keeping Sabbath, and I think part of the reason for that is because I don't know if I'm doing it together with a large group of people. Where Sabbath keeping was happening most regularly and routinely in my life was when we were with a group of people who, we would come for worship, and then we'd really make a whole day of it. We'd stay and we'd have lunch together, and then maybe around 2 o'clock, everybody go home, take a nap, or maybe go for a hike individually. But then we would all kind of come back together in the evening again, kind of to close out the day or to frame the day. We'd all get together for, Bible study or for time of worship, or maybe even just coming over for a meal or whatever. And there is something to this business of doing Sabbath together, both as it seems to work its effect in the lives of the individual, and I think there's a real powerful testimony there as well too. We'll maybe come back at that at the end. But just in the few minutes I have left, yes, I am going to get to Hebrews 4. I am going to get to our text. There's this one last aspect of Sabbath that I want to draw your attention to, which I think is really important, especially in the time we find ourselves in right here and right now. All right, so hang on. We got to go as like a whirlwind here through what in the world is going on here in Hebrews 4. First of all, book of Hebrews, one of the major concerns for the writer is that God's people would faithfully endure, or faithfully persevere, while they wait on the return of the King. Or to put it another way, more in keeping with the language of the book of Hebrews, the intent is that God's people, or the concern is that God's people would be faithful and endure and persevere while they are journeying to journey's end, to that greater eternal city, New Jerusalem, New Eden, the full manifestation of God's kingdom on earth. And the book of Hebrews is written to a group of people, like so many of the New Testament letters, who are having a tough go of it all along that journey. Right? Are facing hardship, pain, difficulty, are being persecuted for the name of Christ, are suffering slander, are suffering exclusion or ostracization from the community for the sake of Christ. Right? And here's the thing. With that comes all this sort of temptation to fall away. Right? There's all this temptation when that hardship hits. Hey, if I just went back to my old way of life or my old religious systems, I wouldn't have to suffer half the stuff that I'm enduring right now. Or there's all this temptation to bow the knee to some other rival god or some other rival would-be savior because maybe they can get you a little bit more in the here and now than God seems to be providing for me. And so the concern for the writer is that they would stay fast, that they would endure and be faithful. So for instance, if you were to peek back up in chapter 3, verse 6, he's reminding the people, look, we are God's people. We are his household if indeed we hold fast our confidence and we hold fast our boasting in our hope. Right? And then what he does in the next part of chapter 3 is he actually quotes from Psalm 95, basically to remind his readers, hey, you're not the only people who've had to walk through difficult circumstances en route to God's promises. You remember the Israelites? Right? You remember the ones who got delivered from the tyranny of Egypt? who had this glorious land of promise in store for them, but in between they had to follow him through a wilderness. A wilderness which is uncomfortable. You have to go without a little bit. A wilderness that maybe has some anxious moments in it. And here's the thing. What happened to the Israelites as soon as they started to feel the heat of the wilderness, or their bellies started to grumble, or they started to feel a little bit anxious? They complained and they groaned. And they said, Moses, why did you bring us out here just to die? We were way better as slaves in Egypt. And eventually they gave themselves to horrible idolatrous practices. And ultimately, you could argue they just lost faith completely in God. When God was asking them to go in and take the promised land, they said, no way, I'm not going in there to fill with giants. I don't trust that you're going to be with us and you're going to give us what you promised to us. So at the end of the quotation of Psalm 95, we read, and I swore in my wrath, God says, that they shall never enter my rest. And so the writer goes on in chapter 3 to say to his people, look, you need to take care, brothers, lest there be in any of you an evil, unbelieving heart, leading you to fall away from the living God. We need to exhort one another every day, as long as it is called today, so that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. All right, we too are in a day and age where the deceitfulness of sin is running rampant, and there is this temptation to fall away. So we have to be diligent, we have to take care, we have to urge and admonish one another. Or in verse 1 of our chapter, verse 4, he says, chapter 4, therefore, while the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us fear lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. All right, now hang with me. This is where he gets really weird and funky in the passage. He again quotes Psalm 95, talking about how I swore in my wrath they would not enter my rest. And then he goes on to say this, although God's works were finished from the foundations of the world, for somewhere, I love this line, I think you can't remember the passage, for he has somewhere spoken of the seventh day in this way, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And yet again in this passage, he tells them, they shall not enter my rest. What in the world is the writer talking about? Well, he's first quoting from Psalm 95, but then he's connecting Psalm 95, actually all the way back to the very beginning, Genesis chapter 2, and that original seventh day where God stopped and he rested. And here's the interesting thing about those days of creation. If you go back and you read the creation story, and you read the different days of creation, there's sort of a pattern to the description of the creative activity that day. Right? We hear what God creates, and then there's usually the line, he looked at what he created, and behold, he saw all of it was what? Good. And then there was morning and evening, the first day, or morning and evening the third day, or morning and evening the sixth day. Well, interestingly, when you come to day 7, we're told what God does, but we don't get that line about there being morning and evening the seventh day. It's like this day doesn't come to a close. This day just kind of drifts on into perpetuity. So what are we saying? That God is just still in his seventh day rest and he never went back to work on Monday morning and he's in his eternal rest? His hands are off the wheel, he's created it, just kind of let it go, and now he's just kind of kicking back with his feet up and whatever? Well, yes, but no. Yes, he is in his perpetual rest, but it's not necessarily rest the way we would often think about it. In the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, rest kind of has dual meanings. One, it could mean a ceasing of activity, but then also it has all of this royal connotation as well too. Rest, think of like when a king would come to rest on his throne, or a god would come to rest in his temple. It's a royal description. And that's sort of the idea here in this unending day of day 7. God has created his creation kingdom, and now on day 7 he has come to rest in his kingdom. He's come to rest in his garden sanctuary and begun his great rest, his great reign, if you will. Turn the page to chapter 3. Everything goes haywire. God's people align themselves with God's enemies. They bring sin into this whole picture. And then, to make a long story short, in some way now they lose their enjoyment of God's perfect creation. As sin is now interwoven into the whole picture, they lose their enjoyment of participation in God's rest, if you will. And they're actually kicked out of that garden sanctuary, that place where God has come to rest in his kingdom. And arguably the whole rest of the Bible is, how do we get back to that? How do we get back to that kingdom? How do we get back to that royal rest that God is in and our full enjoyment of that? So, for the writer of Hebrews, definitely that whole reclaiming operation is underway with the coming of Christ. He's begun this whole work of restoring the kingdom, restoring us to the kingdom, but it's not completely done yet. There's still some of it to come. There's still kingdom to come. There's still that rest of God that we are still journeying towards. And so he's saying, as long as the promise of entering God's rest still remains, let us be careful, lest any of us would seem not to enter into it. Okay, do you see the picture there? And then here's the main verse, main point. It's really kind of a simple point. In verse 9, he calls that, he says, so then there remains, and here he coins a new term, a term that we find nowhere else in the Greek New Testament, nowhere else. He calls this, there remains for us in the future a Sabbath rest. Sabbatismos is the Greek word. There remains for us a Sabbath rest for the people of God. So why is that so much the point? You see, for the writer, he has this notion that all eternity, when we reach journey's end and we get to that great kingdom restoration, in a sense, it will be eternal Sabbath keeping. That in a way, for the writer, all of eternity will be every day, all day, enjoying what we enjoy in the weekly Sabbath. Or if I could say it the other way, here's the point. For the writer of the Sabbath, for the writer of Hebrews, for the New Testament church, even in the Old Testament, Sabbath keeping was, yes, remembering what God had done in the past, remembering his creative activity, remembering his redeeming activity, but it was also a day that signaled and pointed them forward to the reality of the even greater Sabbath rest that is yet to come. It reminded them that there's hope beyond all the mess of the wilderness and all the mess that they're living in right here and now. And not only was it a reminder, but in a way, their weekly Sabbath keeping was actually practice for eternity. It was actually a way of enjoying right now in the rhythm of our days and our weeks some of what we'll enjoy through all eternity in the uninterrupted presence of God in his eternal kingdom. See, I think what the early church understood was that part of being deeply rooted in the hope that is yet to come, part of being deeply rooted in all the rich promises that God has in store for us, was actually building into their sequence of time, 1 day in 7, where they actually stopped to remember that and to look forward to that and actually practice some of that, of what is yet to come in the future. And this was huge in terms of helping them to stay rooted as a people of hope while they were living in difficult times of persecution, hardship, suffering, and so forth. So again, I wanted to zero in on this aspect, the pointing forward aspect of the Sabbath, partly because I think, as Chip was mentioning, as he was leading us in worship this morning, we find ourselves in strange times where we're not able to fellowship and not able to do church the way we would like, and there's a sadness to that. There's a little bit of anxiety, fear, uncertainty. There's stresses with all of this shutdown and quarantine, and what are we going to do in the fall with the kids and all this stuff, right? And it's just constant. Not to mention, I always like looking at Lauren McLean's social media memes about 2020. this messed up year. Right? There's been so much. There's been all the racial injustice, and we've been reminded in new ways that we're still a people that suffer with racial tensions, and there's still so many things that are not right in our neighborhoods and our communities. Not to mention we're going to be entering a political season here. We're starting the political conventions, and so stuff is just going to get really ugly. And all of this on top of just your regular, every other day, pressures and stresses and fears and failures and all of that. And sometimes in the midst of that, that's just overwhelming, and it's an awful lot. And here's the thing. Sometimes the truths that we know in our head, the doctrines that we claim about God and His salvation in Christ, sometimes those, if they stay in the head, it just kind of falls flat in terms of having any power to overcome the overwhelming emotions and fears and anxieties and disappointments of the struggles of day-to-day life. And I would maybe say to you, or I would say personally to me, what has really helped me, I think, to become a person who is so much more rooted in the reality of the hope of the return of Christ and the consummation of His eternal kingdom. Well, it's been not just hearing words, but actually putting that into practice and actually engaging in habits and rituals every week that point me forward and give me small tastes of that. And I would say for you, if you're someone here this morning or watching at home who right now, amidst everything that's going on in life and in the world, you're struggling to have the truths about Christ and the realities about His salvation, all that He's done, you're struggling to have that make any real impact on your life, or you're struggling to feel the joy or the rich satisfaction of that maybe you've enjoyed in the past. Encouragement for you might be, try practicing Sabbath. Try routinely just setting aside one day where you clear space through the whole day to be attentive to who God is, to what He's done in His creation, what He's done in His redemption, and what He's up to in your life and the lives of God's people. Take one day and cease from not just your work, but try to cease from your daily struggles and your daily battles that you face. Maybe if you're someone who's wrestling with, certain anxieties, or maybe you're wrestling with guilt, or maybe you're wrestling with shame over past failures, or maybe you're wrestling with tensions, interpersonal tensions that you're experiencing with other people. Why not just take one day and just stop, if you're able, from all of that? Stop from that, knowing that Christ has paid for your shame. He's paid for your guilt. That Christ has already overcome all these problems that you're mentally trying to solve in your head day in and day out. Just take one day, rest in the accomplishments of Christ, and don't fight those battles. I think I told you a couple of weeks ago we liked that movie, What About Bob? If you haven't seen that, it's the movie of a shrink who's tormented by one of his easy-go-lucky patients. But early on in the movie, the psychologist tells Bob Wiley, "Hey Bob, I'm going to write you a prescription. Take a vacation from your problems." And in a way, it's in a cheap way, it's sort of how I think about Sabbath, that we're given this invitation. Hey, you can take one day in 7, and you can stop from all these battles that you are waging against. Right? You can let that go. 1, because it'll be there tomorrow when you go back to it. And 2, because Christ has already been there. And what you might find is that as you do this week in and week out, you actually might go back to Monday morning facing those battles in a somewhat of a different way. So take a Sabbath. Set aside time to be attentive to who God is. Just quit fighting your battles. And also take a day where you practice eternal time. Or maybe you don't turn on the news. Or maybe you don't pull up your Facebook feeds knowing that I'm going to have to scroll through a whole bunch of negative junk before I get to see what my friend is up to, as a way of just, hey, I don't need to focus on everything that's not right in the world today. Today I'm going to give myself to remembering what's yet to come and delighting in that. Get together with God's people. Celebrate some of the eternal time where we'll be with God's people, feasting and celebrating together. My guess would be that as you do that, not just once, but as you make a routine, ritual practice of that, you might find it having real impact on your life and your family. And I would just say to the rest of you, if you maybe don't feel right now that I feel like my relationship with Christ is going great and all these rich truths and doctrines are having deep, meaningful impact on my life and I don't need another ritual. And I might be a little bit suspicious of that based on how rituals were so important in the life of God's people. But I would also say to you, you might want to consider that, well, okay, maybe you don't need it, but maybe your brothers and sisters need you to be a more regular Sabbath practitioner. Maybe your brothers and sisters need the power that comes from corporately celebrating Sabbath together. And so maybe you would consider being a part of that for the sake of your brothers and sisters' need. I'm already over time. The last practical thing I might say to you, if you're interested in diving in and exploring this, I might say to you, nuts and bolts. First, maybe consider finding a group of people to do it with. And maybe first you get this group of people together and you start together diving in and understanding a little bit more about what the Sabbath is, how it functioned in the lives of God's people, and then maybe you together decide to think, okay, how would we together in our individual separate lives and families go about practicing Sabbath together, and then you hold one another accountable to it. And maybe on a weekly basis or every other week or once a month, maybe even you get together at the end of Sabbath to kind of close the day and bring it back all together. Just something to think about. Big picture is we're part of this incredible story. Incredible story of a holy God who has given us this wonderful creation. Incredible story of a holy God who has worked sacrificially for our redemption to restore us to his kingdom and his eternal rest. This incredible God who has this great promise and this great future for us. And these are more than just ideas and doctrines and things to understand in your head. These are things to practice and to live out in habit and ritual and activities together. And as we do that, I think we'll find our loves and our worship being shaped. And again, our enjoyment of Christ and our rich experience of his life increasing all the more. So we ask that God would lead us in all of this, ultimately for his honor and glory and the things that he's trying to do in and through us. In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit.